Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, our eminent audience and distinguished speakers, regionally and globally. It's our pleasure to have you here today for this very special event organized by Trends. Trends' objective is to cover and discuss all strategic issues that has regional and global after effects in a scientific and objective sense to fulfill our vision of foresighting future through knowledge. We are gathered here today to address a topic that has not only global implication but implication for humanity. We have faced countless challenges and impediments and obscurity at our ends, but we have managed to be with you today to address the context and the peculiarity of coronavirus pandemic in a scientific, objective, and sensible way. This symposium is part of Trends e-event series that investigate and address strategic issues of global nature. As per The Economist magazine, the novel coronavirus has killed thousands of people around the world since it first emerged in December. Our assessment at Trends is that only through collective global response we will be able to overcome this challenge, like many other crises the global community has overcome in the past. We will carry an investigation that covers all aspects of the pandemic in this e-symposium, the scientific health, the political, economic, and social consequence. I would like to welcome our speakers, Professor Maurizio Barbici and Dr. Hussein Ibish, Associate Professor of Economics, scholar at the Arab Gulf State Institute in Washington, Professor Gulfaraz Khan, Dr. David Meyer, and Professor Yong Wang. I would like to leave the floor right now to Dr. Stephen to ask some questions on the global health outlook.
Hey, good evening, good afternoon, gentlemen. We're very grateful and privileged that you've been able to join us for this virtual symposium, the first that Trends Research and Advisory Center has hosted, and we're very grateful that you've been able to spare the time to join us today, and that I'm sure we'll have a very useful and interesting discussion. I will ask each of you in turn to give your presentations, please, and after each individual presentation, I will ask one pertinent question, just to expand on any, or to explain any remarks that have been made. Once we've been through all 5 presentations, then we will open the virtual floor to a more general discussion. And when we reach that stage of the symposium, we also hope to be getting live responses through Twitter and by email, and we hope to get through as many questions as possible, questions sent by we hope, thousands of people who will be following this live event. So I think we should move on as quickly as possible. First of all, I would like to introduce Professor Maurizio Barbici, who is an adjunct professor of global health security at the Faculty of Medicine of the Flinders University in Adelaide in Australia. And he is also special advisor to the executive director of the World Health Organization's World Health Emergencies Program. I should emphasize that Professor Barbici is not speaking for the WHO, he's speaking today in a personal capacity. But please, Professor Barbici, if you would like to start proceedings, please. Yes, we can. Thanks,
Yeah.
Professor. We can hear you now. Thank you.
A classic, the mute of unmute. I wanted to thank you, start again, for this invite and express and extend my gratitude for the organizers. There are times that we are living. It is indeed a moment in which our reflection should drive into before and after the event. Like in big events of the past centuries, we will be having times before and after the pandemic. And we will be learning on to live with this idea, this experience in the post, on the aftermath of this event. Just bullet point. The first is, of course, our heart and mind goes to the people in the trenches that are fighting the disease, all of the colleagues and nurses that are there sparing no efforts to save lives. At the end of the day, this is what we are talking about. So the first line of reflection is how the health systems and how the human beings, those operators, are saving life and moving and try to fight the disease left and right, following the movement and the progress of the pandemic. Moving from health system to systems, so how the societies, how the different countries are facing different moment of the outbreak of the pandemic, and how measures imposed or taken are taken at different moment in different society. So you have several moving targets of different population density, age, baselines of diseases, rich, poor, that are taking measure like staying home, social distancing, traveling at different moment of the number of cases they are actually in the community. So extracting data, making reflection and projection on this type of uncertainty is not easy. Third point, we have been preparing for pandemic since a decade now, since the SARS. And it is impressive how not prepared the planet was. So despite reflecting is the difference between crying wolf and facing the wolf. Another point of reflection for the rest of the conversation, of the dialogue, would be how the modus, how the experience of having lockdown, having certain activities or privilege or mindset that we gave it for granted may affect the changes of the individual, the society, the systems after the pandemic. And it's not just goods, commercials, economies. It is a real deeper level of reflections that may impact governance, trust. We are working a lot with the sector of large events, and the football, the society, the NBA shut down. There is no Olympics today. The Dubai Expo for tomorrow, they are postponing the Dubai Expo as well. And all of these events, when they will start again in phased way, and we are in provided advice how to reopen or how to start slowly a normal life. And my colleague from China will elaborate on that later, because it's not just the peak of the epidemic that we are speaking of, but also the bumping and the re-entry in the communities and in the society that we will have to manage. Who are we going to listen to? Are we going to listen to our Minister of Health or to our football player or basketball player or faith-based leader? All of those reflections may be different in a few months or few years' time. Even the thinking of a vaccine, of a silver bullet, as it says, may have to be handled with extreme care for not creating groups of haves and haves not, north, southish. Is this going to be cyclic, like influenza, seasonal, or is it going to be a constant, like measles or other diseases? All of these reflections are there. I wanted to share with you, so you can have a baseline of dialogue to have just not economic conversation, but as a society as a whole, for its structure, its capacity, its nations and sub-nations, people and sub-people, in terms of aggregation when they get together and how do they think, and what all of us will be doing next. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
This.
Thank you very much, Professor. I mean, I suppose a general question that would occur to me, just immediate response to what you've just said. It's of course it's very early days. We're waiting in many cases to see the peak of the crisis, and people are already perhaps speculating too much about what the potential responses to this crisis or similar crises might be in the future. Do you think there's scope for reform of international cooperation on dealing with such an outbreak? I'm talking about international governance, international mechanisms, information sharing between national authorities. Do you think, I mean, it's very early stages, of course, do you think there are any obvious ways in which that international cooperation can be improved?
Is an extremely clever question. I can tell you some facts. It is obvious that the travel or the shutdown of travel didn't work well. Was even late, was not selective, was not smart enough. So what the first reaction, the first weaponry of government so far wasn't enough or smart enough or quick enough or big enough, large enough to stop the exponential the move of the virus. And then itself is a reply to your question. So we need to look for something different, because if a next wave comes and we still try to lock down the borders, it shows that we didn't learn our lesson. We as a collectivity. Certain measures like lockdowns are useful if done in a certain moment of the pandemic. Other solutions like Korea, the contact tracing, the testing, are being proven and successfully useful if you have enough contact tracer, if enough place to put the people, if enough testing to do the thing. So offering one solution without thinking how the whole system would react, that can be done in Wuhan. The same solution of Wuhan can be done in Lagos, Nigeria. Would it be done in New York? The size is the same. London, Delhi, perhaps, is not the same solution. Even if the solution is proven successful in that moment of space and time, may or may not mean it works elsewhere.
Okay, thank you, Professor Bambeshi. Thank you very much for your remarks. I'll quickly move on now to our next speaker, Professor Gulfaraz Khan, who is a distinguished practitioner, professor of viral pathology, and also chair of medical microbiology and immunology at the College of Medicine and Health Sciences at the United Arab Emirates University here in the United Arab Emirates. Professor Khan, if you would like to make your comments, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers for this invitation. As my previous speaker mentioned, I think we need to give credit and take our hats off to the frontline workers throughout the world, the nurses, the doctors, the healthcare practitioners who are giving up, risking their lives for the protection or for the treatment and helping the individuals with COVID-19 infection. The current crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, has actually affected all of us. In one way or other, it's affected all of us. From the health and scientific community, at one end of the spectrum, it's united us, I believe. But at the other end of the spectrum, I believe that it's revealed some of our weaknesses and some of our lack of preparedness for such an event. Emerging and re-emerging infections are not new. They've been happening for thousands of years. I mean, take the example of the 1918 influenza pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu. It's estimated that this killed between 17 and 50, this is at least one estimate, between 17 and 50 million people lost their lives during the Spanish flu. This pandemic, the virus, believe it or not, the case mortality rate with this virus was estimated to be between 3 and 5%. But however, the virus was able to spread to more than a third of the planet. Third of the world population got infected with this virus. Hence, the huge number of deaths that occurred as a result of this pandemic. In 1957, the so-called the Asian flu, again another influenza virus, followed 10 years later, 1968, by the so-called Hong Kong flu. Both of these influenza viruses or flu viruses, again, led to well over 1 million deaths. You may think that this is in the past. Within the last 30 years alone, we've had dozens of outbreaks. I just want to highlight just a couple of these notable examples. Take the bird flu, the H5N1 in 1997, the SARS coronavirus outbreak in 2002, the MERS, the Middle East coronavirus, in 2012. And more recently, we had, in 2014, we had the Ebola outbreak, which killed an estimated over 12,000 deaths, infecting over 28,000 people. So the point I'm trying to say here is that this snapshot of historical narrative gives you a perspective that emerging and re-emerging infections are not new, and COVID-19 is not going to be the last either. This may sound as a pessimistic point, but these viruses have been happening for 1,000 years, and even after we overcome this crisis, we can expect, we would be naive to think that COVID-19 is the last pandemic outbreak that we are going to get. So what do we need to do? We need to be better prepared. That's what it's not a matter of when, or it's not a matter of if a pandemic happens, it's when it will happen. And furthermore, in terms of all these examples I've given you, there is a common theme in all of these. All of these viruses are of zoonotic origin, meaning these are viruses which infect animals, and there's a spillover from animals into humans. So again, we need to take assess our policies with regards to animal involvement, our practices in terms of farming, all of these, and transport of animals. All these issues need to be taken into consideration in order to avoid and prevent such infections from taking place. We have already learned, I mean, this pandemic is not over, but we've already learned a number of important lessons, even at this early stage. One is that as far as infectious diseases are concerned, they do not need borders. They do not respect borders. They do not need a passport to travel from one country to another. So as far as infectious diseases are concerned, we all, that is, the whole world is basically one global village. And we need to communicate and collaborate together if we are to be able to prevent some of these infections from taking place. They will not respect the borders, and they will not need a passport to come. And this COVID-19 infection is a classic example how, in spite of our efforts, the virus spread across the world and is continuing to spread. The other thing that this virus has already, this pandemic has revealed is that the scientific community, compared with previous experiences, this time the scientific community worked much more closer, much more actively in order to minimize, believe it or not, to shed light on this pandemic. The virus and its disease was announced at the end of December 31st to the WHO. And within 2 weeks, the Chinese authorities not only had identified the causative agent, not only had they sequenced the virus, but it was made available to the international community. Within 2 weeks. Now, this has to be acknowledged. This allowed early development of diagnostic kits. So it's important, again, illustration how important it is to share information and collaborate with individuals. The scientific community over the last 2 weeks or 2 months, we've seen unprecedented number of publications on COVID-19, the virus and its disease. Again, we are learning from these experiences in order to understand what are our best options to reduce, prevent, and control this infection. As my previous speaker also touched on, this outbreak has also revealed some of our shortcomings. One of these shortcomings is we need to be prepared for such an event in a way that we can do testing, isolation, quarantine, follow up on trace contacting as early as possible. If we do not recognize these diseases early, trace them, and stop them and contain them, they will spread. They will spread. So this is an important lesson that we need to learn, that do these steps early in the epidemic. If you think about this, within the announcement from the Chinese, we had approximately, in my humble opinion, we had approximately at least a month window period to look at this disease. A month before the virus was spreading across, but at a lower level. So we had a window, a month's window opportunity to try to prepare. Some countries, of course, took these active measures, the so-called draconian steps in order to contain these. Others were a bit more relaxed. And this is partly what is reflected in the numbers that we have across the globe. Some cases by February, from majority of the world's cases happened after February. And yet you see the differences in the numbers are vast. Some countries that are still in their hundreds, while others are in tens of thousands or even over 100,000. So again, these are some of the lessons that we need to learn as a community. And finally, if I may, for the future, I think it's absolutely essential that we invest in research and development in infectious diseases to better understand these diseases, such that we can at least reduce or prevent them from becoming a global pandemic. And the global pandemic, when it happens, we've seen what the consequences, what the devastation that such diseases can do, not only in terms of human life, but in terms of the economy and in terms of the actual way of life of individuals and societies. So I think this is important that all of these considerations are taken into place in future preparations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Khan. Thank you for your remarks. The question, this is probably very unfair. The question that first came to my mind is, when will we get a vaccine? Perhaps I should, a more realistic way of asking that question is, once a vaccine is developed, how long will the testing, verification, distribution, effective distribution, how long does it take for a vaccine to be rolled out for mass consumption, as it were? I'd like to ask your thoughts on that, please, if I may.
Yeah. That's actually a very good question, and it's a very logical question. And to be honest with you, the individuals working in the vaccine field will tell you that it's unlikely we will have a vaccine within the 12 months. The predictions are that even at the stage that we are working on, and there are a couple of dozen or more than a couple of, it's estimated, I think about 36 different companies and research institutions are working on developing a vaccine. Now, it's estimated that this will take anything between 12 and 18 months to develop a vaccine. And from the point of development of the vaccine to actually having this produced in mass quantities and to be delivered and to be for the population to be vaccinated, this is going to take time. So it's not going to happen over the next few months. That's all the experts will tell you, that this is not likely to happen. So it's a long term. I think by the time we get a vaccine and try to prevent this, we're in there for a longer period, unfortunately. But there are a number of drugs which are also in being tried and tested. So the field is open, it's very fluid. Regularly, we're coming across literature studies which are stating that this drug, anti-malaria drug, or even earlier today, we were talking about vitamin C, for example. So there are a number of drugs which are being tested. But testing is one thing, and having something which has been proved in a controlled trial is something different. So yes, different institutions, different countries may be trying out various drugs, but in terms of clinically controlled studies, they are far and few between.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor. Moving on quickly now to our next speaker. We're very happy and grateful that he's been able to join us from Washington, D.C., Dr. Hussein Ibish, who is a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, D.C. Dr. Ibish, please, if you would like to make your comments.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been asked to look at the question of the impact of the novel coronavirus on international relations and security issues. And so, I mean, I think that when it comes to international and strategic questions, there's probably going to be less of a before coronavirus and anti-coronavirus distinction than there will be in some other fields like public health, with one key exception: the question of the future of populist nativism and nationalism in the West, in the United States and Europe, versus the post-World War II emphasis on international cooperation that the populist nativist narrative attacks. Right, so that I think can be heavily affected by this crisis. Right, in the short run, the nationalists and parochialists, the kind of nativists, best exemplified by President Trump, but also including the Brexiteers and a lot of different European right-wing parties, will benefit. And it's not clear in the long run whether an emphasis on parochialism and closed borders would triumph over renewed openness. It's not clear at all. Excuse me. The nativists have immediately seized on this crisis to try to reinforce their parochial and even xenophobic attitudes. In Matteo Salvini in Italy, blaming migrants and refugees without any evidence for spreading the virus, have similar discourse emerging from the Front National in France, the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, President Trump saying that redoubling his efforts to build a wall on the border with Mexico, saying that somehow it's connected to the spread of the virus, again, without any evidence or logic, and his efforts to call it the Chinese virus, which led to violent attacks on Asian Americans. rhetoric of Brexiteers in Britain, and the widespread use of travel bans, right, all over the world, which seem to make sense at first, and that can buy time and calm the populace, but are not solutions. But they do reinforce the value of national separateness as an idea that is linked to literal as well as cultural and identitarian survival. So there is this sort of adrenaline rush for insularity, parochialism, and that sort of separateness that nativist populism promotes. That it's not a solution is demonstrated maybe most dramatically by the fact that the coronavirus is now in Gaza, which is about as isolated a place on Earth, and there it's there. So, in other words, again, these bans could buy you time, and create the illusion of doing something, but they're not really going to, protect you from the spread of a virus, right? So, my point is that even though there's a kind of adrenaline shot for parochialism, in the long run, the pandemic could presage a return to centrist politics in the West, in the United States in particular, but in Western Europe as well, and to a renewed emphasis on multilateral cooperation and economic globalization, which are the two things that European and US nativist populism attack most intensely, along with migration, which is linked to centrist politics and multilateral cooperation. And the reason for that is that both the medical and economic dimensions of the crisis and also possible security implications, which I'll come to at the end of my remarks, of this pandemic call for expert leadership and international cooperation. The two things, again, that populism greatly attacks. The populists set themselves up as enemies of administration and expertise and elites, and enemies of international cooperation and multilateral institutions and economic globalization. And they do this in the name of the people, the real people, often non-urban and white people. And I think in the end it's a sort of siren song that the COVID crisis confronts with a cold dose of reality, that if you want to defeat this, you actually need administrative expertise and professional experience to do that. And somebody's demagogic impulses and feelings is not going to do the trick. Now, when it comes to international competition and cooperation, as I say, I foresee the need to revive multilateralism, because it's really going to be necessary for countries to work together in order to defeat this. It's no good, flattening the curve in your country when your neighbors are not able to do that. It's got to be done in a holistic way, or the virus is simply going to keep coming back to you. On the other hand, even if there is greater cooperation among great powers, responsible actors, and multilateral organizations are revived or restored, it's becoming clear bad actors are not changing their ways, right? This is very important. So that it's not any thought that aggressive regional would-be hegemons like North Korea or Iran would be rethinking their destabilizing policies has, I think, been refuted by their own behavior. Iran, beset by the coronavirus, by the economic crisis, by the crisis additionally from sanctions, and the oil price war, has not changed its way at all. And in fact, has even started to escalate again in Iraq. With more attacks on US and British targets and whatnot. And I think North Korea has made it very clear it's not going to ratchet back at all either. And I think it's a real question whether Turkey would be in any way inhibited from pursuing its own Eastern Mediterranean hegemonic project linking up with the GNA in Tripoli and claiming control over a good third of the Eastern Mediterranean. I don't think this is going to stop any of that at all. Now, on the other hand, you do see forced cooperation at this local level between rivals. Even Israel and the Palestinian Authority, at a time of maximum tension and mistrust, have been forced to cooperate to try to keep the virus contained on both sides of that divide. And I think it indicates how actors that are fundamentally responsible can overcome even the deepest suspicions, and even the threat of annexation by Israel is not stopping the PA from trying to work with the Israeli authorities to contain this. Now, the other thing that's worth mentioning is that the virus in the short term poses a real threat to democracy in many countries. Now, first, authoritarian states like China in particular say they're better at the discipline and population control and surveillance needed to contain the virus. And China, which is the source of the crisis, of the epidemic in Wuhan, I'm not blaming the Chinese, but I'm saying that it is very remarkable that China is using the pandemic now to promote its system and its international brand and its international leadership. But I think there's a real question about whether any of that is true. At what cost does that discipline and control come? What about all the incentives to lie at the micro and macro level in authoritarian systems? Is China lying to the world about the number of victims? Is Iran lying to the world about the extent of the epidemic in their countries? I think not. Is it a coincidence that they were two of the hardest hit countries? I'm not sure. There is this impulse, there's this incentive not to tell the truth in an authoritarian system. And I think we saw that in China and in Iran, where local officials did not want to be honest with national leaders, and then national leaders did not want to be honest with their public. And I think also that populists with authoritarian impulses like Trump are bringing elements of that into the American system. But in the end, I believe truthfulness and trust, both within governments and with regard to the public, are keys to long-term success. Now, open and closed systems have both had successes and failures in dealing with the crisis. But in the end, it's strategies and administrative systems and not ideologies that will work. And that, I think, will prevent, ultimately, China from using the pandemic to really increase its international leadership. And it may bring populism to heal in the West. Populism will not go away, but I think it may be dealt a serious blow. In some countries, we've seen, though, how local leaders can use the immediate threat to subvert rule of law and even democracy. In Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu has saved himself from the dock and maybe even prison by manipulating the crisis and sort of doing away, at least for a time, with Israeli constitutionalism and accountability in order to preserve his power and stay. Basically, he told Israelis they have to stay in their homes so that he can continue to live in his own, which is a very remarkable thing, but he seems to have gotten away with it. And Hungary is a very alarming indication that demagogues can use this crisis to centralize power. Viktor Orban, in my view, is unlikely to be the last demagogue to exploit the pandemic to claim and seize dictatorial power. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how the rest of the EU reacts to Hungary ceasing to be a democracy in any sense and creating a new fascist dictatorship in the middle of Europe and in the middle of the European Union. One final thought. I don't think that the virus and the epidemic is going to have a major or long-term impact on levels of conflict, even though it may on the trajectory of multilateralism and globalization for the best in the long run. Would there be a more intense struggle for resources? I don't think so. We may see more of an emphasis on countries developing and maintaining strategic reserves of key equipment like personal protective equipment, ventilators, other medical devices, but eliminating or reversing the global supply chain so that everyone makes their own supplies is unnecessary and pointless, and I don't think you're going to see that. I think creating strategic reserves and capabilities is more rational and more likely. And in a sense, maybe this is a giant SARS experience for Western countries, and see how well South Korea and some other East Asian countries have done in dealing with this. It does have something to do with their experience with SARS in the past, and I think there's an analogy going on in other countries. The one area where this crisis could create real security issues and destabilization beyond health security is on the issue of mass migration and refugee flows. If the virus becomes uncontrolled in South Asia and Africa and other places where the healthcare infrastructure is so lacking that it could produce not global migrations, but border tensions and conflicts, such as has been seen in northern Syria and Idlib, regarding Turkey's intervention to try to keep Syrian refugees out of Turkey, and Turkey's use of the threat of refugee flows from Turkey into Greece and elsewhere to compel Europe to help Ankara pay for housing Syrian refugees in Turkey and even in Syria. And again, though, dealing with the border crises from refugee flows because of the spread of the virus would, I think, in the short run might remind people that borders are so wonderful and this illusion of separation. But in the end, to deal with it, international cooperation by great powers and regional and multilateral institutions and large and fixed alliances is going to be the only way to do it. So my sense is that in the long run, the parochial and nativist bubble in the West will probably be burst, at least to some extent, by this crisis. And international cooperation would be reinforced, if not resurrected. And I think in many cases, centrist policies and respect for professional expertise and administrative experience, which Western version of populism and nativism has tended to attack, I think will be recuperated and revived, at least to some extent. And that, in the end, suggests that international cooperation will actually be benefited in the long run by this crisis. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ibish. I suppose my question builds on your very interesting comments. Would you agree that globalization now has a kind of crisis of legitimacy in that it's not seen to work for enough people? The caricature is that it only works for a neoliberal elite. Yeah. How can globalization reestablish its legitimacy and help to head off the rise of populist movements that you referred to?
That's a great question, right? So that is really one of the main reasons why populism has taken hold in Western countries, especially in parts of Europe and in the United States. And even in Australia, by the way. There's this idea that globalism has cost the working class, non-urban, largely white people their former position, and that it has empowered and rewarded elites and migrants, right? There's this idea that, the very top has benefited and the very bottom, the migrants who are day laborers and whatnot, who are, the very bottom of it, that they've benefited too. And so the traditional middle class of Western societies has paid the cost. I think that the problem, though, is not with globalization as such, right? I mean, you can't, first of all, there's no way to move the clock back. It has happened. And every demagogue who has tried to promise a return to a pre-global supply chain order has been lying to people. And I think that's become increasingly clear. I think the answer has got to be within states themselves. In the United States, the crisis of income inequality, the denigration of the middle class, and the elevation of an extremely elite super rich is not the result of globalization. It's the result of a series of laws and policies that have been developing since the early 1980s. There is no national effort to stem income inequality. On the contrary, even up to and including the last tax cut under President Trump's, the first half of his term, when he controlled both parts of Congress, promote income inequality. So I think the answer is not to reduce economic globalization or to falsely promise people that manufacturing jobs can return to countries in which that's not, it makes no economic sense, but rather to address the laws and policies that produce and facilitate and reinforce the unequal distribution of the fruits of globalization. The U.S. economy has grown. The U.S. GDP has grown. The fact that there's income inequality is not the result of the growth, albeit smaller than it used to be, but the fact that we now have 2.5% growth over the past 10 years, rather than the 4% or 4.5% growth of boom times before, right? That's not the cause of income inequality and the middle class crisis. The cause is the tax structure in the United States, the healthcare system in the United States, the way the society and the state and the laws allow the concentration of income in a very small elite. That is easily resolvable. I'm not easily resolvable. It's better resolved on a national basis than by trying to rethink these macro historic trends that have actually produced growth and produced wealth. And the fact that people have been hoarding it with the connivance of governance is not, I think, an argument against economic globalization that drives growth.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ibish. Thank you. We'll move on quickly to our next speaker, Professor David Mayer, who's associate professor of Security and Global Studies and program director, Master of Arts in Diplomacy, the College of Security and Global Studies at the American University in the Emirates, here in the United Emirates. So, Professor Mayer, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to say that what I'm about to present is simply my own personal professional opinion. I'm not representing the positions of my university or the Emirati government. This is just my own analysis. I think it would be tremendously boring to have an e-symposium where everyone agreed with each other, nor particularly productive. So I'm going to be quite controversial and provocative, quite purposely so, by respectfully disagreeing with about 2/3 of what Dr. Hussein Ibish has just said. First of all, however, before I address that, I'd like to say that if we were to answer the question that whether the current crisis is going to further globalization or fragmentation of the international community, here I would agree with Dr. Ibish that the crisis is not stopping a number of current conflicts. In fact, I'm predicting it will make them a good deal worse. For example, several dyads of conflict are, in my opinion, being exacerbated by the crisis. We've got the US and China, which are basically blaming each other for either creating the virus or perhaps failing to stop it through concealing information or inefficient management. You've got the Russians and the Europeans who are accusing each other of putting out false news about the virus. You've got the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and Iran. And how has the virus made this worse? Well, there's some Saudis in Al-Sharq al-Awsat who are accusing Iran of purposely sending people to GCC countries in order to seed them with infections in order to weaken the GCC's regional and global standing and strength. Meanwhile, America and Europe will further tighten their restriction of entrance of immigrants from the third world, as they are now considered to be a biohazard. And thus, Donald Trump is highly likely to get his wall on the Mexican border. And I think that you'll see even leftists beginning to support this, even as surprisingly you've seen those Republicans more on the right now supporting a kind of emergency temporary national minimum income distributed by the government. Okay, so the immigration is going to take it a severe reduction, I believe, because now there will be increased support. But unlike Dr. Ibish, who denounces this as nativism and racism and so on and so forth, I think that this is, in fact, well-founded fear of infection, even if the current, well, we don't have statistics on the Syrian refugees, for example. We don't have statistics on illegal migrants coming in from Mexico. But there's a good deal of reason to fear that they could be further seeding virus in Europe and America that are already experiencing an out-of-control epidemic. And so I think that not only will this lead to further lockdowns of the borders like Greece did with Turkey to stop the Syrian refugees recently, particularly in sense that it was a Turkish political move. And I think that there is going to be a continuing backlash in the United States towards the Democratic Party seeking to import people into the United States to do what Americans won't do, namely to vote Democrat. Thus, the virus is already a political weapon internationally. It, in the future, may actually be used as a bioweapon if it has not already been used as such. I wish I could predict sweetness and light, health, wealth, and prosperity for everyone. I'm afraid that the facts do not lead me to such a conclusion, but rather that we'll see an intensification of conflict. There has been, thankfully, some increase in international cooperation in fighting the disease, such as sharing the RNA decoding and cooperation in research. This will probably increase. Certainly it should. But critically, it won't increase in a number of areas, particularly in the sharing of sensitive information, which is perhaps the most important amount of sharing. But now, as ever, knowledge is still power, virus or no virus. And since knowledge is power, this is why many countries don't want to share that knowledge, and particularly for both domestic and international political reasons, are suppressing and indeed fabricating the statistics on how many infections they've got. By that, I have in mind China, Iran, the Russians, and then there's, of course, the North Koreans who simply aren't publishing anything. So would international cooperation be good? Well, yes. On the other hand, if you cooperate and others don't, you risk getting what in political science and international relations we call the sucker's payoff, where you cooperate, you put out, you pay, and the others don't. They free ride. And so this has happened, I'm afraid, a lot in the past with supposedly free trade, which was not free at all, but rather neo-mercantilist, more on that. But it's particularly true in the current situation where, just like with intelligence sharing about terrorism, so also with intelligence sharing about the coronavirus. Everyone, after a major terrorist attack, everyone says, oh, we need to increase international cooperation and information sharing. Yes, that would be a wonderful thing to do. We all need to do that. And so when we have a coronavirus, everyone says, yes, we ought to share more information. Everyone ought to do that. But then the intelligence agencies don't share a lot of their information, in fact, a minimum, because they're afraid of exposing their intelligence sources and methods. Likewise, I'm afraid we're also seeing a minimal of cooperation from some countries who either want to monopolize vaccine or who simply are afraid to let the truth come out about how many cases they have, because it would simply reflect badly on them politically, both at home and abroad. Furthermore, the interdependence of the modern world economy with globalization has always been thought by neoliberal institutionalists to be a path to peace, because killing your customers is bad for business, and therefore international trade will lead to more peace. However, many scholars of political science have pointed out that complex interdependence increases your vulnerability so that others can hurt you a lot by cutting off crucial resources. And already we're seeing countries competing with each other more over sources like wood pulp for masks and toilet paper, and manufactured gowns, medical supplies like gloves, masks, medical gowns, hand sanitizers, most critically in the field of medicines, more on that later, and especially the expensive and high-tech products like respirators. Throughout human history, international trade has always existed. It will certainly continue. It may be taking a hit now. It will come back, but with some changes. And what are those changes going to be? I predict that they're going to be that America's previous tolerance of discriminatory tariffs, like by other countries, particularly China, but also other trading partners like Canada and the EU, will be much diminished. The US will continue to demand more fair trade deals, regardless of who wins the elections in November, because Americans simply cannot afford to keep losing $500 billion a year to China every year in trade deficits. Even Trump's worst enemies agree on that much. So after the coronavirus crisis is passed, and in a few years it probably will, hopefully, but it could become permanently endemic. The Spanish flu went away after 3 years. We have no idea how long this will last. But protectionism is going to come back with a vengeance. And why? Because already a number of countries were in a recession even before the coronavirus hit. Now with the forced quarantines, even more countries, including the United States, are into recession. And I predict that within a few months, we're going to be far off worse than the Great Recession. And if the mandatory quarantines last more like 6 months, then we're looking at another Great Depression. So the geostrategic impact of this influence of the coronavirus is that as the US and the European Union become poorer, they will become even less receptive to China's mercantilism, cheating on trade, and theft of intellectual property. They will certainly reconfigure their supply chains because the advantages of China's low-cost labor are now going to have to be balanced by security, not only the security of the products being imported, as in making sure they're not contaminated by coronavirus, particularly China's food exports, but also whether China will simply use them as a weapon and either threaten to cut them off or actually cut them off. Russia has done this with Western Europe and usually tends to do so right in the middle of the winter. China already threatened to cut off the Japanese from rare earth commodities, which would bring China's high-tech economy to a standstill. And now you have threats from China that China could cut off the United States from crucial supplies like the ingredients of antibiotics to fight the complications, the secondary and opportunistic infections of coronavirus. And we find out to our horror that 90% of American antibiotics rely on ingredients sourced from China, including 60% of our penicillin. Furthermore, even a lot of the medicines that are not actually made in China, but rather made in India or in other countries, actually rely also on Chinese ingredients. And the Chinese, and by the way, the Indians also now are saying that they may have to restrict the export of antibiotic ingredients. Now, this is going to severely worsen, especially if these threats are made good on, the relations between China and India, and it's going to cause a lot of rethinking. Indeed, it already has. Senators Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee and Tom Cotton of Arkansas are already introducing legislation to force American manufacturers of critical goods to reintroduce into the United States the production of these critical ingredients and critical machinery. And I believe that in the future, America will be willing to pay the price of this inefficiency in order to maximize security. When societies collapse, it's often because they were interdependent and then suddenly got cut off from the very things that they were the most dependent on. Now, redundancy is inefficient. If you're going to live in a perfect world, free trade, if it was actually being practiced, would be the best solution if there were no security threats. However, this perfect world doesn't exist, and certainly not in our present situation. Thus, an increase in certain areas of inefficiency through redundancy must be done in order to make sure that other countries cannot bring the United States or bring Europe to its knees through threatening embargoes. And the United States will not soon forget the threats to cut us off from antibiotics. It will not soon forget the allegations by members of the Chinese Communist Party that somehow the American army virus and introduced it. This has, I think, permanently harmed American-Chinese relationships more than anything else since the Chinese intervention in the Korean War. Now, I'm not saying that we're going to go back to the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that greatly worsened the Great Depression and killed off about a third of world trade. No, we're not going to go back to Smoot-Hawley, I doubt. But we will be playing hardball with the tariffs. Trump's already done that. Even if Joe Biden wins the election, America is likely to continue to do that, although with a lot less gusto and enthusiasm. And simply, this will be a necessity. A poor America and a poor Europe cannot afford massive trade deficits with China. They will force them to either reduce the export of non-essential goods into America or Europe, or they will simply heavily tax them. I don't think that the major geopolitical alliances will shift at all. And this is because cultural affinities, contested borders, common economic interests will remain largely the same after the pandemic recedes. It's not a game changer. The coronavirus is not a game changer that can change long-held national aspirations like the Israel-Palestine conflict or the question of whether Sunnis or Shiites will dominate the Middle East. The Houthis, who are allied with Iran, are still launching missiles at the Saudi capital, Riyadh. The Iranians are continuing to attack American forces in Iraq, as Dr. Ibish rightly pointed out. But also Hezbollah is continuing to fight in Syria, and Hamas is continuing to launch rockets into Israel. So while the Palestinian Authority may be threatened or forced to cooperate with the Israelis more, I don't see any cooperation or evidence of cooperation at all so far that I'm aware of that Hamas has taken any kind of a break. America, yes, the world will still need each other through trade. It's simply that the terms of those trades are going to be radically renegotiated because free trade has in fact not been existing. Now, I'm a pro-free trade guy. I'm all for the efficiencies that free trade creates, the wealth that that efficiency from free trade creates. Unfortunately, we are not seeing free trade. We have not seen free trade ever from the Chinese. We have seen a lot of unfair, unfree trade with massive government intervention, and this will rightly cause a retaliation, further retaliation by the American government, because if the Chinese act mercantilist, the Americans will have to act mercantilist as well. And indeed, when the more severe your security threats are, whether they're biological hazards like coronavirus, or whether they're military threats, the more you have to accept the expensive redundancy of national self-sufficiency in at least a few key strategic areas, or else you get risk getting the sucker's payoff, where you get caught with your pants down, Pearl Harbor style, and without even the military buildup that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had rightly put into place even before the surprise attack.
Professor May, I'm sorry, we're sort of running over our schedule slightly.
Thank you.
If you don't mind, I just want to put one quick question before I move on to our last speaker. Do you think we're heading for a new bipolar or multipolar Cold War?
Yes, between the United States and China, most assuredly. That's not to say that it's going to break into full-scale shooting war. I certainly hope not. I certainly don't see it as inevitable that the Thucydides spiral or the security spiral will force America and China into war. However, a Chinese-American war is certainly a lot more possible than most people think, and the massive volume of trade between the two countries will not necessarily stop it. World War I, when it broke out, was at the highest level of international trade the world had ever seen up to that point. And immediately when it broke out, Britain suddenly ran out of sugar and discovered all their sugar was coming from German sugar beets. Okay, so just because the United States and China are trading a lot does not necessarily mean that their future relationship is going to be peaceful. In fact, interdependence often causes greater hostility when people threaten to cut you off, as China already has done to some degree. Will American-Chinese trade stop? No, of course not. In fact, I believe American-Chinese trade will remain quite massive. It will, however, be renegotiated in terms of volume, content, and things like punitive tariffs to compensate the United States for the theft of intellectual properties and an end to the forced transfer of technology.
Thank you very much, Professor May. Thank you for your comments. Move on to our last speaker, Professor Yong Wang. He's been waiting very patiently. We're very delighted that you could join us, Professor. Professor Wang, Professor at the School of International Studies, Director of the Center for International Political Economy and Director of the Center for American Studies at Peking University in China. Professor Wang, if I could invite you to make your comments, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to have this chance to speak over the cloud. The deep thanks to the organizer of this e-symposium, the UAE, the Trans Research Institute. I think this conference is timely and important to the people, at this moment of the pandemic. My job was given as to share some thoughts on some lessons about China's experience of coping with the COVID-19. I will focus on that.
Okay. Thank you.
I think from the floor, I heard a very important word. Okay, that is globalization, global village. I think indeed we are in this era. Okay, that also bring the rapid expansion of the virus like COVID-19, which has imposed the challenges, like the Dr. Ken's the remark. Yeah, he said that this is not the last one. Like the virus like that to cause the global public health the crisis. Yes, I think at this moment, we have seen the tiny virus, right? That's been very dangerous. So the infection is strong, very long the hibernation. A lot of people tested several times, right? So they had to show the positive, right? Some people they have no the symptom, right? So and I think some states now they're still in the process of deepening the knowledge about this virus. Okay, that is some difficulties rising up during the period dealing with the challenge. I see when you look at look back what China has done, especially at initial stage, right? So it's very I think comparable to what is happening in the European countries and United States, right? China is an emerging economy and developing countries, right? So that is something comparable, right? What China has done right, one is a very tough measures adopted, like a lockdown in the city of Wuhan, in the Hubei province, okay, that's so-called epicenter, right? So now when we look at to look back, we found that okay, that is must do, okay, that is necessary, the measures, right? And that is some experience they might be applied elsewhere, right? The lockdown, the social distancings, right? The quarantines, right? So the earlier you have done, you have adopted, okay, that better. You might have some suffer from the short time sacrifice, okay, like the personal, the freedom, the moment of the people, the economic the cost, but that can be helpful to overcome, to get the virus so in control. So in China, the such kind of the lockdown measures not limited the city of Wuhan, but it also is in other provinces. The second thing is about in containment of the virus. Okay, that is one principle. Okay, in China is that so-called for the early terms, right? Is a early discover, the early report, early quarantine, and early treatment. Okay, that is something, of course, in this process. Okay, there's diagnosis and nucleic acid test is very important, right? So the beginning, that is the government asked for, the patients to have the quarantine or the stay at home. But in the middle, we'll find that okay, that is not enough. Okay, that is the rise of the makeshift hospital. I still take advantage of the big the public facilities to collect all this the symptom the patients. Another thing is very important. I think that is caused a lot of misunderstanding. Okay, that is to ask people to put a facial mask on. Okay, because okay, a lot of the cases show that, right? So the infection is strong. In some cases, even the 15 seconds, they can be infected. Okay, that's the airborne transmission of the virus. So I think it's necessary to do so. But in European in the countries and in the United States, okay, people has the very different opinion. That's part of a culture. So I think by these latest studies, right, by the Chinese scientists, right, so that might be one of the causes, very important causes to cause the so rapid, spread of the viruses. In these countries. Now another thing, okay, that is related to the China's the system, that the strong, okay, the stronger mobilization, so ability, and the manufacturing and building facilities, right? So in this case, we will say, okay, the central government is in the power position to collect the prevention, okay, the medical teams, okay, from all the other provinces and in the military, to concentrate the medical resources dealing with the crash of the medical system locally. That is very very important. Okay, that is to help to help the local hospital to deal with this overwhelming the demand. Right. So another thing about in terms of the manufacturing protective suits, facial masks, right? So that okay, they have a lot of very rapid transition, okay, for a lot of factories, right? So in the 10 days to build up to the ICU hospitals, right? And we're also seeing the very important role of the science and the research in this. Dr. Hans did mention that, especially genical sequencing. Okay, that is shared by the Chinese scientists within 2 weeks. Right. We also see, a lot of the 5G assisted, so the remote diagnose, right? So we see the big data, the intelligence, the AI, to apply in helping, combating the virus.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Wang. Just a brief question: is China prepared? Some people are predicting there could be a recurrence. This virus could come in waves. Cases may decline and then they may increase. Is the Chinese government prepared for a recurrence of the virus if cases increase again?
Yes, see, by now, okay, I think the pandemic is well controlled now. I think that it is the factories, the companies now is reopened. Okay, the business reopened now, but the government still has a very cautious approach. Okay, I think that is still in the preparing for the second wave of the impact. Right, so I think now the more we have the growing the numbers of the cases of the imported cases by the international travelers, especially the Chinese students, the study abroad. Okay, they would like to, come home at this moment, right? So that is impose the challenges, to the whole system. Another factor, you see that because, as I said, right, there are a lot of unknowing the things about the virus, right? So some states think about it might be a comeback, so in the winter. And we also the saying, see the possibilities. The virus might be a route back and forth, okay, from the both the parts of the globe, south and west, over retaining, and you see by the changes. So I like to see because I would like to say on that part, you see that is the impact of the U.S.-China relations, right? And the West relations and China's initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, and its implications to China and the UAE relations. I would like to make the short comments on this, right? Yeah, we have a lot of pessimistic opinions from my colleague, okay, in this in the conference. I share a lot of observations and concerns, but at this moment, we have the one so we can be sure that is there will be a lot of changes after the pandemic. But the question that is we are not sure how much and to what extent these changes will take place, right? So we don't know when we can contain the virus. We don't know if there will be the systemic financial the crisis or the even global economic recession or the depressions, right? And we are not yet know, okay, what will be happening, okay, to the great power relationship. But we do know that, right? So the international cooperation is needed to fight the virus. The global crisis needs global solutions, right? So if we, the two latter, that is the bias of ideology, the racism, and the great power, the strategic rivalry, to get out of control, all of us will suffer. So I think the key is to avoid the worst case scenario. A lot of concerns here is we need conduct effective dialogue between the civilizations between the governance, the systems, right? So they mentioned that is a democracy, of the the system like China, Russia, of the Iran, all the between the difference between the freedom of individuals and the order. It seems to me, okay, there is no the definite, the clear line between the two. By the dialogue, we can find the very good chance to find the common grounds, okay, between the individual values, right? So with people that like us, working in the academic field, and sometimes we working also working as the policy advisors, we need to promote such ideas, the dialogue, okay, the promoting the mutual understandings of different values, different cultures, different systems, right? Not just to go to the extremes, right? The last word about the UAE and China relations, okay, that is something asked by the friends, okay, with the Trend Institute, right? So that is, the Belt Road Initiative, okay, if the Chinese, the concept for international corporations, right? So that can be a very good platform for the countries in the region to work together. That is a good chance to promote peace and shared prosperity among the countries, either in the Persian Gulf or in other countries. Right, to the UAE, I think I'm quite optimistic, okay, about the potential, the role of the relationship, promoted, okay, by the Belt Road Initiative. The UAE is a very important partner of the Belt Road Initiative, and China opening it's the 1.4 billion the population, the market to the UAE and other countries, right? So that is a lot of chance for the countries in like the UAE and the Persian Gulf, in the Middle East and China to work together, right? So that is I'm cautiously optimistic about this. So I think if we work together, right, we can calm down, okay, that strategic rivalry among the major powers. We can make contributions to international peace and cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Wang. Thank you very much to all of you. We'll move on to a Q&A session now. I should just point out that we're getting a steady stream of questions from, I understand to be many people are following our discussion. It's generated, we're getting a tremendous response. It's generating a tremendous amount of interest. All I will say is that some of the questions I think we will offer to all of the panelists. Some of the questions we will address to individual panelists. But if I could ask you all, please try to be as brief as possible, because we've used up most of our time. We've still got a bit of time, but if you could give the briefest answers possible, please. So now I'll hand over to my colleague Mahmoud Sharif, who will start the Q&A session now.
Yes, we have received a lot of questions, and it covers basically all the areas in which you have an expertise in. And as Dr. Stephen mentioned, some of the questions are addressed to all the distinguished speakers. Some of the questions are addressed to a specific speaker in particular. So the first questions, so I would be asking a question, and then of course Dr. Stephen will be asking a question as well. The first question has to do with the issue of the national and supranational response, and I think this is a recurring question or trend. The question from the audience says, do the experts at the E-Symposium think that time has come for a globalized framework and institution that may directly intervene and supersede ineffective national response during such crises and avoid humanitarian disasters that we have unfortunately seen in some countries. Of course, I would like to add that there are exceptions to that. Of course, in the case of South Korea, probably some other country, UAE is another example of that. But again, how do you feel about the globalized framework and the fact that there are some countries have been, or some national jurisdiction have not been as responsive or as effective?
Well,
Yes.
I could start. I mean, I can simply reiterate what I said in my remarks, which is that I think that parochialism will be reinforced in the short run, but international cooperation will perforce be strengthened in the long run, with some caveats. I mean, I agree with Dr. Meyer that trade will be renegotiated. There's a consensus on that in the United States. And there are other aspects of, certain strategic stockpiles and strategic ability to produce things. Yes, of course, there will be a rethinking of some of these details. But I think, generally speaking, that's the way it will go. Now, the potential for a coordinated global response is not there. We don't have the international mechanisms for that. Countries will have to manage largely their responses largely on their own, with international support. And that's what we have. We don't have any kind of multilateral mechanism for dealing with the kind of detailed sort of interventions, either public health or economic, that national governments will have to lead. And I don't think we'll come out of this trying to create them either. I think that the more likely scenario is a new revitalization, recuperation of international cooperation between states. Yeah.
If I may follow up.
Yes, David. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I agree with Dr. Ibish that there will be a renegotiation of trade as well as long-term cooperation, but I would reframe the terminology used. Dr. Ibish calls it parochialism. I call it national interests. Throughout history, countries have always had national interests. They've also had class interests. It all depends on how you define the word populism. If you define populism as simply being stupid, ignorant, and uneducated, the unwashed masses that are despised by the elites as quote-unquote deplorables, well, then I don't think that's a very good definition of the word populism. If you see the word populism and national defense from external security threats as valid concerns by people who are inherently and intrinsically just as valuable as the so-called elites, then I think that is a very legitimate thing. And so both national interests, not parochialism, national interests, class interests will continue. International cooperation will also continue, as they always have throughout all of human history. The question is, more specifically, are we going to have open borders, and specifically in the age of the coronavirus pandemic? I would say no, we are not, and that the closing of these borders are necessary. And actually the closing of these borders would be a lot better solution if it led to a more permanent resolution of the Syrian civil war, as well as Latin American corruption and inefficiency and mismanagement that caused so many people to flee their country looking for the better life in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to speak.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Professor Wang?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm not necessarily, different what the argument by the Dr. Meyer and Dr. Ibish. But I would like to argue that why the global crisis need a global solution. So the good news is that you see that several days ago, the G20 had the leaders special session of the leaders meeting, right, hosted by the King of Saudi Arabia. On the next day, the presidents of China and the United States had a conversation with each other to convey constructive message to the international community, right? So we need, right? We might, see, we are different. Okay, we have our own the national interest, right? Facing up this grave challenge, we should work together for our own, right? So that is something we have to do, right? Another things about the impact of the economic globalizations, right? Some adjustment, is justified, but generally speaking, the globalization bring forth the benefits to all of the nations, of the countries, right? The problem is that is the failure of the domestic policy, right? How to ensure that is more even, the allocation of distribution of the benefits from the international cooperation of the global supply chain. That's a problem, right? So when we point to blame the populism, not just scapegoating the other countries, okay, emerging economy like China, the India, right? So the most important things for the American politicians in some countries, right, not try to scapegoat the others. They should reflect their policy. So I think, for example, the U.S. Okay, by this standard, U.S. is the country among among developing countries. It's affected by the worst case, the wealth gap, to compare with Japan. What's the problem? Right, this is not the others' problem; it's its own problem. Okay, so I think we can be very dangerous. So if just the manager to skip between the others, right? So we can very long talk about the causes of the so-called unfair trade, right, of the trade war. But so I think we need have broader perspective about all these issues.
I'd like to answer that, Dr. Wong.
Could I just allow Professor Cam?
Very quick.
I'll come to you, Professor May. Professor Cam, please.
Yeah. Very, very quick point. Guys, reality is what the impact from this COVID pandemic will lead, whether the world countries will unite or not, I cannot say. But what I can say is that do we need to unite in terms of confronting an infectious disease like the COVID-19? The answer, I think, unanimously will be yes. We would. I'm not saying whether the countries will unite politically or economically. That's a separate issue. But as far as battling or confronting an infectious disease like that, then we do not have a choice. An infectious disease emerging in a small area somewhere in a developing country today will arise tomorrow in a Western country, irrespective of how developed that we are. So again, we cannot ignore even the developing countries. We may seem that, okay, this is thousands of miles away, and therefore this is not relevant to us, or this will not impact us. No, it will impact us. The disease happening there, whether it's in the camps of Rohingya in Bangladesh, or whether it's in the camps within the Syrian refugees camps, the catastrophe that can emerge and can happen as a result of this outbreak will be devastating, and it will impact everybody everywhere. So we have to, at least from a public health perspective, we have to unite in confronting these results. Otherwise, unilaterally, we will not be able to defeat these infections. Can I just finish with this one last example? There's a virus called West Nile virus, which primarily happened in the Middle East. 1999, the virus was detected in New York, and it took the authorities significant amount. I think something over 66 individuals got infected. Significant number of these individuals died because they were not expecting West Nile to be a virus which infects the brain and causes neurological problems. US was not expecting that virus to have emerged there, but it did. So yes, these viruses, emerging infections, as I said earlier on, do not respect borders. And unless we work together in terms of containing them, I don't think it will be easy to control. Thank you.
Professor May, you wanted to make a point, please.
Yes, I'd like to note that in the $2.2 trillion stimulus that the US Congress and President Trump just passed, there was included $11 billion to help Africa. However, while it is true that it would be good to strangle the dragon before it, or crush its egg before it hatches, the fact is that foreign aid frequently is not able to stop viruses when they start, because so much of the aid is stolen or otherwise misappropriated by local corrupt bureaucrats. This is a problem that means that the United States, Europe, China, other countries cannot just pour money at the problem. They have to carefully monitor the execution and spending of every dollar, or else the people most in need generally don't get it. The other thing is, yes, I would love to see more cooperation internationally, including from China. I would like to see the Chinese Communist Party stop blaming the United States military for producing the coronavirus. I would like to see China cooperate more and really welcome this for China to allow more freedom of speech so that people like Dr. Liao Wenjiang don't get arrested and threatened, so that the information of the viruses can be spread so that more precaution can be taken, because an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. And if you didn't have a repressive authoritarian state who is persecuting Christians and Muslims and Uyghurs and Tibetans, if you had more freedom of speech that allowed doctors to freely warn the population that we have a problem here, it's an epidemic, then a response could happen more quickly. As well as, of course, other areas of Chinese cooperation, such as removing anti-ship missiles and anti-aircraft missiles from the Paracel and Spratly Islands, which are not occupied by the US, but by China, perhaps by returning the Aksai Chin and parts of Arunachal Pradesh back to India. These are elements of Chinese cooperation that I think would be most welcome in the world.
Thank you, Professor. I'm sorry, gentlemen, that I mean, obviously, US-China relations, that's perhaps the most important relationship in the world at present. But I don't want to just.
I think to be very brief.
Wang, I'll take a brief response from you, Professor Wang, please.
Thank you. I think the Dr. Mayer, in a very short time, to the capture of this, I think we heard a lot of. That is from the American medias. Right, so in the period, we call it the stage 1. China is affected by the virus, COVID-19, right? So it's American media, right, published articles like China is the sick man of Asia. So that is something. It's something, to put the ideology, the political biased over humanism. So that is something is very bad, set very bad examples, right? Now, look at what is happening in the United States, and you're a great leader in such a democratic countries. right? So they have to prove, you care about the people. You can so have to prove the value of democracy, right? So I think all these things. Okay, now we're seeing the U.S. government, the national security team, right, is coordinating, coordinating the media war on China. Okay, that comes from some fear, okay, about the U.S. But the U.S. Hegemonic position, the dominance, okay, the position in the world. But that is not a good time to argue in this way. I don't want to be engaged in it. Such a quarrel, like it doesn't make sense, right? What we should do now, right, to fight the virus together. Whether you're American, you're Chinese, Europeans, right? All of us, a human, will be affected, will be infected, right? So that is something. That is why we have to work together, right? So please set aside this the bias ideological from the racial, okay, from ideology, from part of this. We have a lot of I hope the trained institutions, UAE can be a bridge, right, to to continue such a conversation, right? We have a lot of things to discuss, will be very helpful. But if we can have try to be more neutral, okay, not be biased.
The most
Thank you.
important
Thank you. I'm sorry, gentlemen. Please, I must move on to another question. We have lots of questions. It's something I think it could dominate the discussion too much if we stay on the U.S.-China relations. I know it's a complex, it's a very intense issue. I have a quick question I would like to address to Professor Khan only, please. It probably required a short answer. Just wanted to change the focus, reorient the focus perhaps onto what we should be talking about. The question is the malaria vaccine an alternative cure to coronavirus until the right vaccine is available?
Okay. Okay. Firstly, it's not a malaria vaccine. What you're referring to, it's an anti-malaria drug. Hydroxychloroquine is one of the drugs used for the treatment of malaria. Now, a number of countries and number of institutions, hospitals are actually using this anti-malaria drug for the treatment of COVID-19. But I must stress here that these are anecdotal studies. In terms of a scientific study, it has to be a controlled study in order to show whether this is effective compared with those patients who were not treated. Often some of the studies I've come across is that hydroxychloroquine is one among the multiple drugs which are used for the treatment of COVID-19 patients. So it's difficult to assess whether it's the anti-malaria, which is the active drug, which is doing is effective, or whether it's combination of the other drugs which are being used. So yes, people are using it. Yes, it's one of the front runners in terms of potential treatment for COVID-19, but controlled studies are required in order to ascertain whether this is genuinely the drug which is effective. And last thing is, we do not want to overuse this drug, because the last thing we want is that the drug is actually approved, FDA approved, for the treatment of malaria. And taking that drug away from the shelves for COVID, when we haven't yet had proven clinical trials for this, I think we have to take that with caution.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question. I don't know if this would be our final question, or you would like to ask another question.
Well, I think this is a very good question. We've got a little over 10 minutes left, and I have a question I'd first like to pose to Professor Dr. Ibish, please. And the question is, we're seeing extensive use of wartime analogies by state leaders when speaking of the COVID-19 crisis. Is the use of this kind of war terminology appropriate in the current situation? I'd like to ask Dr. Ebish first, but also welcome comments from the rest of you, please.
I think it has, there are a couple of reasons why it's appealing and maybe all right in a way, but then there's some dangers. So the first thing is, in terms of the political interests of individual politicians, I certainly think President Trump qualifies, but he's not the only one. Many others. Declaring themselves to be leading a virtual war or something that is akin to or amounts to a war against an invisible enemy is politically useful for them. And it allows them to position themselves as, I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu used this exact appeal to stay out of jail and to stay in power when he probably would have ended up in court, at least. I don't know about in jail, but he was headed to the dock, and he managed to use his kind of pater familia, leader of the nation at a time of crisis, and war is usually the most familiar crisis, as a springboard. And I think President Trump is trying to refashion himself in that way as well, and many others. So in a sense, it has that political appeal. In addition, there is a value in it beyond just political interests, which is you're asking people to sacrifice. You're asking for collective sacrifices, and that's necessary. And you're asking people to obey onerous laws and to take economic hits and to basically curtail their own activities in the name of the broader good to protect, in many cases, those who are more vulnerable, etc. And so the war analogy is helpful in that regard. And also it helps to contextualize what may be overwhelmingly large scale of deaths, at least in the United States. Now, we went from the president saying it's just one or two people, it will miraculously go away, it's no big deal, to talking about the idea that if nothing was done, you could lose up to 2 million people, so that if a number, something between 100,000 or 200,000 Americans died, that would be considered a good job. And this is really, there is no other context other than a war. And in the case of the United States, it's really sort of the Civil War and very few other wars that would produce death tolls that large. So I think, again, that's another reason why people look for those analogies. Now, there is the downside, which is not only the manipulation of these feelings for the personal political gain of people who pose as wartime leaders and sort of say, you must stick with me because you can't afford to test anyone else out. You've just got to go with what you have, which is really a terrible argument, but it has a certain appeal in a panic crisis situation. And the other problem is that it can be used to stoke fear and resentment that's otherwise irrational, that's just being cynically used. And I think we've seen that. Again, I don't want to get us back on the US-China thing, but that you've got the Chinese virus accusation and the Wuhan virus accusation versus the statements by some Chinese officials about the US military bringing it, or other countries accusing each other of deliberately introducing it, in the Gulf region, or this notion that people are kind of deliberately infecting each other or have invented it and are introducing it. These ideas are out there, and when you get into that war discourse, you can stoke xenophobia and ultimately end up in a situation that is extremely counterproductive. So it's multifaceted.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's what they are, please.
Thank you. Professor May, quickly, please, quick comment.
Yes.
I think we've got time for one more question.
One more question.
Just a quick comment from you, Professor May, please.
Yeah, it was not President Trump who brought up the figure of 100 to 200,000 dead. It was Dr. Anthony Fauci of the Center for Disease Control and Dr. Birx now.
But Trump is the one who said it would be a good job. If that number, we would say we did a very good job if it was 100,000 or 200,000. That's an extraordinary thing to say.
And if you look at the context of what Dr. Birx and Dr. Fauci said, that could happen in a worse case scenario if we did nothing.
That was 2 million.
saying that we are doing a lot and that he thinks that it will be effective.
Fine.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Question.
Last
Michael,
questions,
please.
and this will be our final question. And I hope it would capture the frameworks. It's again, it has to do with the international relation, the new order, international political economy. I hope this would be an interesting question. And the question says, who's winning the heights of the global economic order? The new liberal globalist, the populist nationalist, or state capitalist?
Very interesting.
That's open to the whole
That's
panel, I
open
think.
to everybody.
Well, I'd say China is winning, and that's why it's forcing a reaction by the peoples of Europe and the United States, who will no longer permit this kind of zero-sum trade, which is a win-lose, or at least a relative gain problem, where factory after factory in the United States and Europe and Canada continue to shut down as China increases its market share. That certainly will not be allowed to continue as all these countries become poorer as the effect of the massive shutdowns due to coronavirus.
Yeah.
But let me say, I think in the very short run, just very quickly, in the very short run, national capitalism wins out because a major government intervention, supporting companies, whether they take equity stake or not, directing the economy to save it, etc., is so a kind of national capitalism, at least as a stopgap, is going to spread. However, I think in the longer run, the sort of multilateral globalization is not stoppable, even if it's tweaked, even if new terms are demanded as they should be, and even if there's more of an emphasis on leveling the playing field and saying, for example, to China, you're not a developing country anymore. You're not, sort of Laos, and stop pretending that you're, kind of like Burkina Faso and play by the rules of it. That's one thing. But I think that the economic globalization is not reversible, including by the coronavirus in the long run. That's my view.
Thank you. Professor Wang, please.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think this question is very interesting, right? So my answer, the future will be mixed, right? So with this, you see, the pandemic, as I said, the world will see a lot of changes. On the economic, the growth model, we might be see more of the mixture of the market, or the free market, as well as the state intervention, right? So because, we might be, in the future, we will face a lot of challenges like this, right? So in the global scales, we will be prepared for this. So I think a state, a stronger government or the state organized system is needed to cope with, that is kind of the challenges. So I think there's, secondly, when we look at, the U.S., the rescue or stimulus package of this time, right? It's government, it's the U.S. government take care of everything, right? And limited QE, right? So the big package, the big package from taking care of everything, right? So, that is a free market economy. That's not. I'm worried about the U.S. in the future. The secondly, you talk about the U.S.-China trade frictions, right? Right. So what about the case of Huawei? Mm-hmm. Huawei is a private company, right? It's a private company, right? So the U.S. demobilized the state power to intervene, to deny the market access, not limited to the U.S. market, but the persons like the Pompeo, right, travel around, blame the Huawei and the Chinese government fabricated a lot of the conspiracy theories, right? So that is something free market practice adopted by the U.S. I'm very skeptical about that. So that is all will have a very profound implications for the future global order. Intervention, national security will play a very important role in reshaping the future international order.
Okay, thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to have to call time there. I'm afraid it's we've just about got to 9 o'clock. I just invite, if perhaps appropriately, we'll offer the last word to Professor Khan if he wishes to say anything to add. If you want to have a very quick word, and then we will bring the session to a close.
Very
Professor
quick. I
Khan,
think
please.
in terms of the economic changes as following this COVID-19, I think that's not a question that will not happen. It is, again, economic economic impact of this has happened, and this will cause changes in the way we think in the future. But the point is, at the same time, I believe these changes will happen. We will be forced to rethink how we deal. But nevertheless, cooperation, I believe, will still nevertheless happen, and we will be forced to cooperate. One final, in terms of the unilateral, I'll leave this as a question. Should one country be unilaterally making the decisions and should have the power to say, okay, well, we want to implement this economic change or this policy, and have that power to implement these changes unilaterally?
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a great final point
Last
you
word,
made.
I would like to contribute.
Professor Wang, I have to. I'm very sorry. I have to wrap it up there. I have to draw it to a close. I'm very sorry. It's been our absolute honor, pleasure, and privilege to have you all with us. I'd also like to thank everyone who's been following this live feed online. I understand we've had a significant audience as dropped into this discussion tonight. I do hope we get a chance to Trends Research and Advisory here in Abu Dhabi. We will certainly be having more sessions like this. We're actively planning more and more online symposia, and it's a case of watch the space for news of new events which will be coming in the next few weeks and months. But I'd just like to finish. Thank you to everyone. Thanks to our panelists for
Thank you very
joining us.
much.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much
very
indeed. Thank you. And thanks
Let's
to
work for the unity. Okay, the unity. Set aside the biases and differences, working for the shared, mankind future.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much.
Bye-bye.
And have a good
I hope I can join you again sometime. Thank you very much.
You will.
Certainly. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Revish.
All of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.